The morning Natalie Drummond decided Warren Pruitt didn't matter. She hadn't yet had her second cup of coffee, and she would spend the next 11 hours revising that opinion one piece at a time. Natalie was 34 years old and had been appointed Deputy Director of Federal Facilities Operations 11 days ago, which meant she was still in the phase of her tenure where she moved through buildings with the concentrated attention of someone cataloging everything she intended to change. She wore a gray blazer over a silk blouse, carried a leather portfolio holding 3 color-coded assessment frameworks, and had already sent 14 emails by the time she arrived at the Holloway Federal Complex at 7:50 in the morning. The Holloway Complex was a 9-story federal building in the older part of the city, housing 4 separate agencies, a federal magistrate's court on the 6th floor, and approximately 1,200 employees on any given weekday. Built in 1987, partially renovated in 2004, it had since operated the way aging federal infrastructure tends to operate: functional, slightly temperamental, and dependent in ways not fully documented on a handful of people who had been there long enough to understand it without needing the documentation. Her administrative liaison, a thin man named Terrence, who communicated exclusively in bullet points, met her in the lobby and began walking her through the facility assessment schedule. 3rd floor HVAC had been flagged in the last inspection report. The east elevator bank was running 3 seconds slower than spec. There was a pending review from the Air Force Systems Coordination Office regarding the building's fiber infrastructure, scheduled for 10, involving something she didn't yet have the clearance to be fully briefed on. She was listening to Terrence and scanning the lobby at the same time: columns, ceiling tiles, the condition of the floor finish near the security checkpoint, when Terrence said, "And this is Warren Pruitt, Senior Building Systems Engineer. He'll be your point of contact for all infrastructure-related concerns." The man standing beside the facility's office door was somewhere in his mid to late 40s. He wore dark work trousers and a collared shirt with the building's maintenance division patch on the sleeve. He was average height, average build, with the kind of face that takes a second look to remember, not unattractive, but composed in a way that didn't invite attention. His hair was going gray at the temples. He held a clipboard in one hand and a thermal mug in the other, and he looked at her with gray-brown eyes that were patient in a way she would later think of as the opposite of passive. "Ms. Drummond," he said, "good morning. Mr. Pruitt." She shook his hand, already looking past him toward the stairwell access she wanted to inspect. "I'll need you to pull the maintenance logs for the 3rd floor HVAC system and the east elevator bank by end of day. I'd also like a complete inventory of any non-documented modifications to building systems made in the last 5 years. "I can have those to you by noon," he said. "The HVAC logs are detailed. There are some things in there worth walking through together if you have time. Context helps with that system." "End of day is fine for a walkthrough," she said, which was her professional way of saying she had 17 other items on her assessment list and did not currently have bandwidth to allocate to context. She handed him a printed checklist she had prepared the night before. "This covers everything I'll need in the first phase." He took the checklist and read it the way a person reads a document they are reading thoroughly, rather than scanning. He didn't say anything immediately, and she had already begun moving toward the stairwell when he said, "A few of the items here, specifically the fire suppression interface, on floors 4 through 6 and the auxiliary generator sequencing, they're not standard configurations. The documentation you'll find won't reflect what's actually there. I'll annotate." She paused. "Why aren't they standard configurations?" "They were modified during the 2019 infrastructure upgrade. The contractor filed the original spec documentation rather than the as-built. I flagged it at the time. The discrepancies in a memo I sent to the previous deputy director." She looked at him for the first time in the way she looked at things she was actually assessing. He met her gaze without any particular need to fill the silence. "I'll want to see that memo," she said. "I'll attach it to the logs," he said. She moved toward the stairwell. He went back to whatever he had been doing before she arrived. She had already filed him the way she filed most people in the first hours of a new assignment, by function and apparent usefulness, competent at his level. The kind of institutional knowledge that organizations accumulate and then forget to leverage. She did not think about him again for nearly 2 hours. Warren Pruitt's day had begun at 5:20 that morning, 40 minutes before his alarm, when his daughter knocked on his bedroom door and stood in the doorway, holding a drawing she had finished the night before, too excited to remember that it was still dark outside. "I want you to see it before school," said Cora Pruitt, who was 8 years old and had recently developed the habit of completing things at night and presenting them at dawn with the urgency of someone who had been awake, thinking about it for hours, which she had. The drawing was of a bridge. Not a child's approximation of a bridge, not 2 towers and a line, but something with structural intention, with the cable angles indicated and a small notation in the corner that said load-bearing. With a question mark she had clearly added herself. Warren sat up, looked at it for a long moment and said, "The cable angles are right. The load path is right." Cora beamed with the particular satisfaction of someone who suspected a thing was correct and has just been told that it was. "Mrs. Patterson said bridges were engineering," Cora said. "I told her you were an engineer." "I'm a building systems engineer," he said, "but bridges are the same principle." "What principle?" "Distribute the weight," he said, "so nothing has to carry it alone." Cora considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. Then she took the drawing back, apparently satisfied. He made breakfast. She ate without complaint, which was unusual and which he took as a good sign for the day. He dropped her at school at 7:05, where she walked through the door without looking back in the way of children who are entirely comfortable in the places they belong. And he drove to the Holloway Complex through streets still quiet with early morning and arrived at his office at 7:35. 15 minutes before Natalie Drummond pulled into the parking garage in a silver sedan she had clearly just leased. He had read her appointment notice when it came through the internal memo system. He knew her background: urban planning degree, master's in public administration, 3 previous postings in facilities oversight, each one landing her in a position with a wider scope. She was ambitious in the systematic way of someone who has a plan and is executing it correctly. He did not have a strong opinion about this. He had worked under 7 deputy directors in 11 years at Holloway. They arrived with frameworks and timelines, and left, usually, with a more complicated understanding of why the building worked the way it worked. He did not expect that this particular day would become something other than a standard assessment intake. The Air Force Systems Coordination Team arrived at 9:52, 8 minutes ahead of schedule. Warren met them at the East Security Checkpoint and walked them through credential verification, a process that took 11 minutes because one badge had a formatting discrepancy requiring a supervisor override. He waited without impatience while it was resolved. The team was 4 people: a civilian technical analyst, 2 Air Force engineers in uniform and their lead, who signed in under the name Colonel Frank Adler. Warren recognized the name the way you recognize someone you once worked with closely in a context significant enough to leave a mark. He had not seen Adler in 6 years. Adler recognized him at the same moment. The recognition did not happen dramatically. It happened in the middle of a hallway near the East Checkpoint, while the security supervisor was still returning Adler's credentials, and 2 team members were checking their equipment cases. Adler looked up from the sign-in sheet. His eyes moved to Warren's face, and something changed in his posture, not a full stop, but a recalibration, the physical equivalent of a system reorienting to new information. He handed the sign-in sheet back to the security supervisor. He stepped away from the desk. He extended his hand to Warren, and when he shook it, he held it for a moment in the way people hold on to something they weren't expecting to find. Warren Pruitt, Adler said, not a question, a statement of something still arriving. Colonel Adler, Warren said. I didn't know you were here. 6 years, Warren said. Adler looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to the 2 Air Force engineers behind him, both young, mid-20s, with the specific contained alertness of people, early enough in their careers to be paying close attention to everything, and said, with a quietness that carried more weight than volume, "This is Warren Pruitt. If you don't know that name, you should." One of the engineers looked at Warren. Something moved across his face, not personal recognition but contextual. The look of someone placing a name in a larger story he had heard before. He straightened almost involuntarily. The other said quietly, "Sir." It was not a salute. Warren was a civilian. But the quality of attention they turned on him in that corridor, the stillness in their bodies, the specific alignment of their posture, carried the same grammar as one. An acknowledgement that was not courtesy but recognition. The kind that happens below protocol, in the reflex layer where training meets something that goes deeper than training. Warren nodded at both of them. Let's get you down to the sub-level before the junction temperature runs up. He turned and led them toward the stairwell. Natalie Drummond had been standing 14 feet away. She had been reviewing a notation on her assessment clipboard when the Air Force team arrived, and she had stayed to one side to allow the credentialing process to run without interruption. She caught the tail end of it, the extended handshake, the words she had only partially heard, the posture of the 2 young engineers. She stood in the east corridor after they disappeared through the stairwell door and did not immediately continue on to the 4th floor as she had planned. She had met military personnel in professional contexts before. She knew what courtesy looked like. She knew what deference looked like. What she had just seen was neither of those things exactly. It was more precise than courtesy and more instinctive than deference. The security supervisor was still at his desk. She walked over and asked him directly who Warren Pruitt was. The supervisor looked at her with the expression of someone whose answer is not as simple as the question implies. He runs building systems, he said. Has since before I started. I know his title, she said. What's the history with the Air Force? The supervisor seemed to consider. He doesn't talk about it. What I know is secondhand. A pause. There's a woman on the 4th floor, Ruth Vance. She's been here longer than anyone. Natalie filed this and went to find Ruth Vance. Ruth Vance was 58 years old and had worked in Federal Facilities Administration for 31 years, 22 of them at Holloway. She had a desk near the 4th floor window that looked out over the parking structure and a coffee mug that said, "Property of no one," in faded letters. When Natalie found her and asked about Warren Pruitt, she set down the mug and looked at Natalie with the particular assessment that very long-tenured people perform on newcomers. Not hostile, but measuring. He came here 6 years ago, Ruth said. Before that, he was a lead systems engineer with the Meridian Aerospace Defense Program. That's not a program that names itself in public very often. Natalie said she wasn't familiar with it. Most people aren't, that's the point. Ruth picked up her mug again. What I can tell you, because this part is not classified, there was a failure event in 2018. A systems fault in a classified aircraft platform already in an active operational configuration. The fault was in the power sequencing architecture. If it had run to full expression, the outcome would have been catastrophic. Multiple aircraft. Crews aboard, she paused. Warren identified it. He was the engineer who caught it. And he didn't just flag it. He developed the correction model under a timeline that the people involved still don't talk about calmly. Natalie asked what happened after. Ruth was quiet for a moment. His wife died the following year, Cancer, she'd been sick for a while. He had a daughter, 4 years old at the time. She looked out the window. He put in for a transfer to Civilian Facilities Management, filed the paperwork correctly, didn't ask for a reassignment that matched his clearance level or his background. He asked to be released into a role where he'd be home by 6 o'clock. Natalie said nothing. He was here the week after the paperwork cleared, Ruth said. The aerospace program had been trying to retain him. There were offers, I know this secondhand, but I believe it. He didn't take any of them. She looked back at Natalie. He made oatmeal for his daughter every morning, is what I heard him say once, when someone on staff asked about his schedule. He said it like that was the thing that explained everything, and I think for him it did. Natalie thanked her and walked back to the main corridor. She stood for a moment at the east window, looking at the stairwell door Warren had walked through 40 minutes ago. She thought about the assessment checklist she had handed him, the way she had looked past him toward the stairwell access, while he was still responding to her. She went back to her assessment work. She was not someone who let feeling interrupt process. But she was, for the first time since arriving at Holloway, operating with a fraction less certainty and a fraction more attention. The technical crisis came at 2:17 in the afternoon. It began as a notification from the building's automated monitoring system. A pressure anomaly in the fire suppression infrastructure on the 5th floor, in the section running adjacent to the federal magistrate's courtroom. A single alert, which would have been easy to attribute to a sensor calibration issue and schedule for a routine check. Warren looked at the alert number for 4 seconds and did not attribute it to a sensor calibration issue. He was in the sublevel with Adler's team when his radio went. He excused himself, climbed to the 5th floor, and found what he had suspected from the alert pattern: a microfracture in the suppression line at the junction feeding the courtroom section, a hairline split in an aging copper segment that was holding under normal pressure but would not hold if the system triggered. The courtroom was occupied. 32 people in the middle of a federal hearing. He did not trigger the building alarm. A system trigger at that pressure differential, with a fractured line, would have flooded the room before evacuation was possible. He called the building security supervisor and the 4th floor administrative coordinator, simultaneously on a shared channel, gave them 40 seconds of information in the specific clipped register of someone who has communicated technical emergencies before and understands that unnecessary words are a liability, and had the room cleared through a coordinated procedural delay, an announced recess, calm, no visible urgency, in 11 minutes. He was already in the ceiling access panel when the last person left the courtroom. Natalie arrived on the 5th floor at the same time as the building's emergency maintenance supervisor and found a corridor that looked like nothing in particular. A few staff members standing to one side. A facilities cart near the door. Warren's radio on the floor outside the ceiling panel. She heard his voice from inside the ceiling, steady and specific, talking to someone on the shared channel about the valve sequence he needed run from the basement controls. He was precise about timing. He was precise about order. He spoke with the flat, dense accuracy of someone who knows exactly what will happen if any of the steps are wrong. It took 23 minutes. When he came down from the panel, his shirt marked with ceiling dust, he set a section of copper pipe carefully on the facilities cart. He told the emergency maintenance supervisor which replacement segment to order and where it was in inventory. He told the coordinator that the courtroom could be cleared for reoccupation in 45 minutes once the pressure was confirmed stable. Then he looked at Natalie. "The suppression interface on 5, he said. "That's one of the non-standard configurations I mentioned this morning." She looked at the pipe on the cart. "You said the documentation wouldn't reflect what was actually there." The as-built would have shown this segment as original 1987 copper. It was replaced during the 2004 renovation, but with the same spec copper, not the updated alloy. At this point in the line's life cycle, the original copper would have been more stable. The 2004 replacement aged faster. He paused. It's in the memo. She had not yet read the memo. She had received it, forwarded to her inbox alongside the maintenance logs, and flagged it to review after the Air Force team departed. If you hadn't caught that alert, she said. I did, he said simply, and picked up his radio to call the basement controls team for a pressure confirmation. He was not performing humility. He was simply not interested in dwelling on the version of events in which the outcome had been different, because the outcome had not been different, and the near miss was not a use of time he found productive. She had met people like this before, very rarely. Colonel Frank Adler found her in the atrium at 4:30, after his team had completed the sub-level audit and were packing equipment in the loading bay. He was a direct man, which she recognized because she was also a direct person, and he did not spend any time approaching the subject he had come to address. I heard about the 5th floor, he said. Warren's work? She said it was. Adler nodded, as though this confirmed something he already believed. He'd want me to tell you it was routine, he said. He'd be wrong. He looked toward the stairwell. I worked with Warren Pruitt for 2 years on the Meridian program. I've worked with a lot of engineers in my career. What Warren has, the specific combination of pattern recognition and what I can only call structural instinct, is rare in the way that certain things are rare, where you can go an entire career and only see it once. She asked him about 2018. Adler was quiet for a moment. What is not classified? The fault was in a power sequencing cascade, the same class of failure that in an operational environment is unrecoverable once it completes. Warren identified it 12 hours before the threshold, developed a correction under a time window that gave us less margin than I would have liked, held the model together through 2 independent review cycles with 0 errors. He looked at her. The crews aboard those aircraft didn't know anything was wrong. That's the way it's supposed to work. She asked why he had left. Adler's expression shifted, not to sadness exactly, but to something quieter. His wife got sick while he was deep in the program. He was traveling 8 months out of 12. She died in January of the following year. He paused. Their daughter was small. He made a calculation. He looked at the atrium floor. I told him the program would lose something it wouldn't easily replace. He said he understood that. He filed the paperwork anyway. She asked if Adler had heard from him since. No, he said. He doesn't reach back. Not criticism, simply fact. He made his decision and he lives inside it. That's what people who are serious about decisions actually do. He looked toward the security checkpoint. Those 2 engineers this morning, when they saw him in the corridor, they knew his name before I said it. Not because I briefed them. Because at some point in the last 6 years, someone who'd been on the program told them, the way you tell people about something important that you want to make sure isn't forgotten. He said goodbye and walked toward the loading bay. Natalie sat down in one of the atrium chairs and was still for a long time. She thought about the child Ruth Vance had described, 4 years old when her mother died. A father who had chosen oatmeal every morning over every other version of the life he could have been living. She thought about the word context and the way Warren had used it. Context helps with that system, and the way she had moved past it, as though understanding were something that could be deferred, a supplementary layer rather than the structure underneath everything. She had been in her new role for 11 days and had filed 3 preliminary reports. She had not once asked any of the people she was assessing what she didn't yet understand about their systems. She had been wrong about this in a way that was not just tactical. It was foundational. She found him at 5:45 in the sublevel, making a notation in the as-built logbook he kept by hand, a binder organized with a precision that contrasted sharply with the informality of the space itself. His radio was on the workbench beside him. His jacket was on the back of the chair. She asked if he had a few minutes. He glanced at his watch, not pointedly, simply checking, and said that he did. He had to leave by 6. She sat down on a folding chair across the workbench and said what needed to be said without preamble, because she did not think preamble would serve either of them. I came in this morning with a checklist I wrote before I'd spoken to a single person in this building, she said. I handed it to you the way you hand someone a form to fill out. I wasn't interested in context because I'd already decided I understood the shape of things. She looked at him. I didn't. Warren set down his pen. He did not say it's fine, and she was grateful for that, because it would have allowed her to receive the apology without fully giving it. The memo from 2019, he said after a moment. It was sent to 3 different deputy directors over the last 6 years. None of them read it before the introduction meeting. She said that she would read it tonight. I know, he said. You'll have questions about sections 2 and 4. Those are the ones where the documentation gap is hardest to follow without a walkthrough. I'm in early on Tuesdays. There was something in the matter-of-factness of it, not forgiveness exactly, but something forward-facing that she found easier to receive than absolution would have been. She asked about his daughter. Something moved in his face. That particular softness that surfaces in people who love something completely and without apology. She's good, he said. She drew a bridge this morning, got the cable angles right. How old is she? 8. She thinks she wants to be an engineer. What do you think? He picked up his pen again. I think she'll be whatever she decides to be, he said, and that she'll be serious about it. A pause. That's enough. He closed the logbook and picked up his jacket. Tuesday, he said, 8 o'clock, bring the memo. She said she would. She left the sublevel and stood for a moment in the building lobby, nearly empty now in the late-day quiet. Just the security supervisor at his desk and the low hum of the HVAC system moving through the walls like a breath the building took without announcing. She had been in the Holloway complex for less than 10 hours. She had arrived with frameworks and color-coded assessments and the steady competence of someone who had learned, in 3 previous postings, exactly how to take command of a building. She was leaving with something she had not arrived with. The specific, useful discomfort of understanding that competence at the surface level of things is not the same as understanding the structure underneath. That documentation is not the same as the as-built. That the person holding the clipboard is not always the person who knows how the building stands. Warren picked up Cora from the after-school program at 6:10, 2 minutes later than usual, which she mentioned in the tone of someone who has noted the variance and decided not to make an issue of it. He carried her backpack. She carried the bridge drawing, which she had brought home to show him again in better light. They walked to the car in the October evening, the sky going low and amber, and she asked him how his day was. He said it had been a long one. She asked if anything happened, and he said there had been a problem on the 5th floor that needed attention. Did you fix it? She said. Yes, he said. Okay, she said, satisfied, and turned her attention back to the drawing. He drove home through streets familiar to him in the specific way that streets become familiar when you have traveled them long enough to stop seeing them consciously and to feel them instead. He thought about almost nothing in particular, which was what he did on drives home. Having spent the day with his attention fully occupied, he allowed it now to simply rest. Cora made a sound in the back seat that was not a word. The sound of a child who has just noticed something interesting about her own drawing. Dad, she said, if you make the cables longer, does the bridge hold more or less? Longer in which direction? She considered. Up, she said. He thought about it genuinely, the way he thought about most things she asked, without shortcutting to a simplified answer. More, generally, he said. Longer vertical cable gives you better load distribution across the deck, but it changes the horizontal tension on the towers. You have to account for that. How? Thicker towers, he said, or a different anchor point. She made a note on the drawing in the dim backseat light. He could hear the scratch of her pencil. The city moved past the windows in its ordinary evening way. Storefronts pulling down their gates, streetlights coming on one by one, a couple walking a dog past a coffee shop, still lit from inside with the warm, purposeless light of a place that is simply open. Warren Pruitt drove his daughter home through it, and the weight of the day settled around him not as burden, but as the particular fullness of a life that is, in most of the ways that matter, exactly what he chose it to be.